Blue Exorcist is better than I thought. Now, I originally watched the anime back in the 2010s alongside other shows like Maggie and Noragami, and I think that this is the weakest one of them all. I thought that then, and I still think that now, but I do have a much higher opinion of Blue Exorcist now than I did before, and I think that's just because I went back and I actually finally understood everything. There weren't so many issues that weren't necessarily in the manga's control because, of course, I watched the anime, and the anime had so many different issues, whether it was the anime original ending, which it's not like Full Metal Alchemist, the original one, where it was still good because the OG Full Metal Alchemist, if you watched it before Brotherhood, it's still good. It's different, obviously, from Brotherhood, but it was still enjoyable and I think a good quality product. The same was not true for Blue Exorcist. It just kind of felt like everything got derailed. It didn't feel natural at all. And I think that really messed with my experience when it came to Blue Exorcist. And didn't help that right after that they did season 2, and even then I still wasn't in the loop, so I didn't know that this was a sequel that ignored the filler. So I was just really confused during that season 2 time period. So there was a lot that combined that made me just really not like Blue Exorcist all that much. But after now giving the manga a shot, pretty much binging it the whole way through, I actually really do enjoy this manga now. It is way better than I originally thought. But just breaking this down arc by arc, the first one, the school enrollment arc. Now, this list that I'm using, it's not something that I'll necessarily use whenever I'm thinking of the series, but it's a list that I found. But the first one, the school enrollment arc, it's not amazing. I wouldn't consider this like a top tier prologue arc for a shonen manga. Like, I think Naruto's prologue is better, but this one, it definitely did more than just do its job. And the introduction for characters like Bone and his pseudo rivalry with Rin throughout this entire early portion of the manga, I thought that it worked incredibly well. And then other characters like Yukio, where there's a lot of subtle foreshadowing with just so many other different characters. But it's not until the second arc, which would conclude the first season, where other characters that aren't as big of a focus do start getting a lot more shine. But even then, this still feels like all of season 1 and these first 2 arcs, it all feels like a prologue, a really long prologue, because you don't really start seeing a lot of interesting character developments and plot developments until after what would be season, or what is season 1 and these first 2 arcs. But what would be the Kyoto arc, or the Impure King arc, which was season 2, the one that I never really understood when it came to the anime. Now, the Impure King arc as a whole, even thinking on it now, I can't really pinpoint what exactly I didn't like about this the first time around, because this is like top 3 arcs in the series. I do just absolutely love this. I can go back and read this multiple times over, I can already tell, especially when it comes to characters like Yukio. The development that Yukio gets here is pretty insane, and then even characters that don't get nearly as much shine, but they really start to get explored at least a little more. Characters like Izumo, she had, probably one of the greatest moments she still had to this day, when everybody was terrified of Rin because of his heritage. Izumo was the only one that really wasn't, making it a huge deal. And this is really what made me do a complete 180 in terms of just how I saw her character, just because of her reaction towards him. Then other characters like, Renzo, a character who would become, my favorite, or at least one of my favorite characters in the entire series. He doesn't do a ton of stuff here. What makes me really like him is later on, but this is where he finally starts to do some stuff, and that's a big part of why I like this arc. Now, there's of course a ton of other plot developments and just this story as a whole that I think really just works incredibly well, but it's mostly the subtle character work that really brings the whole thing home for me. Now, I wouldn't necessarily consider these next 2 arcs I would never even talk about them as if they were arcs. The Terror of the Kraken arc and the Seven Wonder Academy arc. To me, these just feel like prerequisites or even like an afterthought, or not necessarily an afterthought, but like an epilogue. Like the Terror of the Kraken arc feels like an epilogue to the Impure King arc. The Seven Wonder arc, or Seven Wonder Academy arc, feels like a prologue to the Illuminati arc. So this little portion right here, it's arguably the least enjoyable portion of the entirety of Blue Exorcist. There is some interesting character work to really be appreciated here, but all the big stuff happens before and after these two arcs. Now, while I really enjoyed this manga for, pretty much as far as I'd been reading it to this point, the Illuminati arc is what really made me just want to deep dive into the series and start binging it like crazy. Like, I was very invested when it came to the Illuminati arc. I'd always wanted to like Renzo as a character, but I didn't really have too many reasons to really like him as much as I did, up until, of course, this arc. And then we get a little bit more stuff with Izumo. Overall, this was arguably my favorite arc in the entire series, even to this day. But it is definitely one of the best and arguably the most invested that I've ever been when it came to Blue Exorcist as a manga. But then after the Illuminati arc, there is the Exorcist exam arc, which does feel like just kind of taking a step back from the scope of the Illuminati arc and focusing more on characters, like a lot of what was going on with Yukio, and explaining more of what happened and what made Renzo the way he was. That is some of my favorite bits of the story, even though this can be considered, one of the weaker arcs in terms of just, how little, I guess you can say, that kind of happened here, just because, like I said, the scope is much smaller because there's not this looming just massive threat like there was with the Illuminati arc with characters like Lucifer and whatnot. But when this arc, the character work is what makes me like this series as much as I do. And with characters like Yukio, who is the most interesting character in the series, I think the most layered one at least. And then, like I said, Renzo, he's arguably my favorite character in the series as well, where he just has a lot of charisma as a character and just a lot more other stuff going for him. But him and Yukio having a lot of the spotlight in terms of this arc, it really does make me appreciate it with a lot more, I guess, bias than many of the other arcs in the series. I like taking a step back and making things a little bit more grounded and a little bit more character focused. I think it works extremely well. I've said that like 10 times already, I feel like. The Aomori Hachi Otaro, I tried my best to pronounce that, but this is the first time I really talked about Shura in the entire video so far. I don't even think I've mentioned her name yet, but she's a super fun character, but not really one that has I haven't really been that interested in her. And even after this arc, which solely focused on her pretty much throughout the entire arc, of course there's the dynamic between Ren and Yukio that plays a part here, but when it's focusing on Shura, like, I found it interesting in the moment, but overall Shura is just not a character I necessarily loved, even though she's obviously supposed to be that type of character. She's supposed to be, the character that draws a lot of people in. I mean, she's designed a very specific way, and there's a lot to her character that I feel like is meant to make her popular, and I do feel like she is. She's probably one of the most popular characters in the series, but she's just not a character that I am too interested or invested in. But I did like this little arc that she got here, and I'm glad it was as short as it was. It gave me time to, appreciate her character a little bit more, but not to the point where I felt like I was sticking around here too long and I was getting impatient for like more of the other storylines to develop. I really liked how self-contained this arc felt. The Blue Knight investigation arc is an arc I will always just kind of neglect a little bit because it does kind of precede an arc that I just absolutely love with the Blue Knight Remembrance. But the Blue Knight Investigation, in terms of just what it does for the series, a lot of the twists that happen, especially when it comes with, characters like Yukio and everything going on with the Illuminati, him, Rin, all these other different plot points that are very important. The dynamic, the developments in the dynamic between Rin and Yukio. The Blue Knight Investigation was amazing, but the Blue Knight Remembrance is my personal favorite. I love flashback arcs. It is, like I've said this before, it is my bread and butter. Anytime there's a flashback arc, I'm completely just engaged, and it's no different here. The story doesn't really go in any way that I guess I expected it to, and that's probably because a couple of years, I remember just randomly I decided to check out what was currently going on in the Blue Exorcist manga for no reason, but I didn't go back and read catching up to it. I just started at the newest chapter, and I think it was in the middle of this arc that I picked up the series, and I just read one chapter, and that was it. And I had no idea what was going on, but I do think it was in the middle of Blue Knight Remembrance, and I don't think that contributes to my liking of this arc at all, but it is just something that I definitely do remember. But overall, this arc, and specifically what it does for Rin as a character, I haven't really talked about him too much, because he was kind of just like that very shonen protagonist that's very naive, and I didn't really like him for a lot of the manga, at this point most of the manga, but this arc changes him a lot for me. At least it gives us a deeper look into his character. The introspective aspects to this arc are something that I love. I like this deeper look at Rin, and him saying how he was when he was an infant, and his reaction to the whole thing. It just flowed so well, and I love flashback arcs, and I love this flashback arc specifically. Now, the last one listed is Of One Cloth, and that's not what I would name this. This is basically just the War with Satan arc. This arc has been crazy. The scope has been so much beyond anything that we've seen, and even the craziest arcs so far, like the Illuminati arc. This is the war arc for the series, and it's just everything that you would expect. The climax, everything that has been built up throughout Blue Exorcist, all comes to its peak here. There have been some absolutely insane chapters where we got to see peeks at other possible timelines, which was just crazy. And there's just been so many different, I guess, twists, and Rin, Yukio, all of our characters, the core cast, it has all been great. The one thing is that I will say that is just noticeably negative, and I'll touch up on it a little bit in a second when I talk about the characters specifically, but there is a plot development with Shimmy, and I'll need to reread the series to really say if I'm 100% sure on this or not. But the plot development with Shimmy, and her being more important to the plot than what was originally led on, it feels like such a ridiculous turn in the story. It is beyond the point where I find it actually believable. I don't like Shimmy to begin with, so I'm already biased against her character, but the way everything was executed, it just did not work for me. Maybe there were some foreshadows that I just completely missed involving her character, but it just feels so undeserved in terms of just her character and her role in the story. It felt so forced just because, she's close with Rin, so she has to be kind of forced into the story and be important, whenever I feel like it wasn't incorporated naturally at all. So that is my one complaint, but I have loved this arc despite that one thing that just bothers me to no end. All the characters have been great. The plot has been incredibly interesting, and the art specifically with this arc, has just absolutely blown me away, with so many different panels, spreads, pages. It's been phenomenal. But talking specifically about the characters, Rin Okumura, I've already talked about him a little bit, but yeah, I disliked him for most of the series. He was like I said earlier, that very shonen type character, where I felt like he was just super naive, super annoying throughout most of the manga, despite his very pleasant personality. During fights and whenever the action would ramp up and there would be stakes, he would always undercut all the plot that was happening that made the story interesting. Like his dynamic with the antagonists, it wasn't interesting at all. And I think that it was mostly on the shoulders of Rin why the story and his dynamics with other characters that weren't his friends or his brother, characters that were villains, like it just did not work in the story. It didn't work all the way up until what I called the Blue Knight Remembrance arc, which we saw him go back in time and really explore his roots, where we see a more introspective look into his character and just how he views himself and all the stuff that he's gone through in the 16 years because of his heritage. So there's a lot to his character now that I really do appreciate, and I do like him as a protagonist. Like there's so many other characters that are very popular that also fall in line with a very shonen type character, shonen type protagonist, that I just view Rin as being blatantly better than. And then Yukio, I've also talked about him at least a little bit. Like I said, he is the most layered character in the entire story. His relationship with Rin and so many other characters, it's a deep relationship, a deep friendship, but there's also just tons of jealousy and self-loathing with his character, and just how he views himself as a monster, especially when it comes to like his flame awakening just a little bit, and what exactly that means, and how his relationship with his father is different than Rin's, and how his flames work. It was all just very interesting in the way he kind of processes things, and he's just such an interesting character, more so than I would say every other character in the series. People talk about Mephisto as being the likable one, Rin as being like the pleasant one, the character that you love. But Yukio, he's annoying a lot of the time because of how much of a douche he is. But it's because of his actions that it makes him so interesting. Like they're the wrong choices almost every single time. But because of his jealousy, like you can kind of at least understand his motives, his actions, even though you see them as wrong, and why he shouldn't be doing these things. The fact that you can at least understand him is what makes him so great. Now, Mephisto, like Shura, is one of those characters that he's made to be likable. He has a very unique design, very unique personality. And like Shura, for me, I like Mephisto, just like I like Shura, but I don't love him. He's not one of my favorite characters. He's interesting, there's a lot to, I guess, like about his character, but there's not a lot that I appreciate. Like, it's just very obvious that he is meant to be one of those characters that is supposed to be super popular. And he is. Like, the author did a very good job, because when people are talking about Blue Exorcist, they don't really talk about Rin or Yukio or any of the other characters. They talk about Mephisto, they talk about Shura, and these are the two characters that I feel like they were designed specifically to be popular. So I think the author did a great job when it comes to just executing upon these intentions. Like, he's a lot of fun. I like him, but he's not my favorite character, not by a long shot. I already talked about Shura, I think in good enough detail, so I'm just going to skip to the other classmates, specifically the one I dislike the most, and that's Shimi. Now, she just whines way too much. Like, there's a specific archetype that she fits in with characters like Hinata, or Hime. Like, people would compare her to these characters, and I feel like she is just so much worse, especially than a character like Orihime, who is, exists within that same vein, I guess. But I feel like Orihime is just so much of a better character in terms of her arc. But like I said, I was always waiting for her character to kind of turn around, be more important, to do things that I would consider actual accomplishments in the story. And she does not do that for the first 10 arcs of the story up until the final one, where she's just kind of forced into the situation where it's like, yeah, she is important. She's always been important. She just didn't know that she was important. She's always been super strong. She just didn't know that she was super strong. And I feel like that is very lazy writing. Now, of course, there's always the possibility that I missed foreshadowing. I didn't look up videos on this series, so like I possibly missed some stuff when it comes to that aspect. But still, I also don't feel like I need to look up videos. Like if I can't just blatantly tell, like I looked into the series, I think well enough to the point where I would have seen at least some foreshadowing for a character, and I never did. So I think the execution when it comes to incorporating her into a more important role, into a stronger role, just does not work. Izumo, Ryuji or Bone, and Renzo, all three of these characters I think are just, they shine as side characters. Bone has been consistent throughout the entire story from the very first arc where he was a pseudo rival towards Rin, and then he moved so far beyond just being a simple rival. He's a very interesting side character. I don't want to say he's like nearly as layered as a character like Yukio, or nearly as popular or likable as characters like Mephisto or even Ren for that matter. But there's a lot to really appreciate with Bone as a character. But on the less likable side, Izumo is a character that I didn't like at the beginning, just because she was just blatantly written to be unlikable. Like she's a bully. Like that's just what her character was, especially early on. And then she got shown, especially through Shimi's kindness, like the error in her ways. And even though I don't like Shimi, I like what her character did for Izumo as a character and how she changed her. But like I mentioned earlier, when it came to her reaction, especially given her history, her reaction to Rin, finding out that, his heritage, and specifically on that train ride to Kyoto, her interaction with Rin while everybody else was avoiding him, I just really liked that point in the story a lot. Like it's a highlight just for the entire story. I feel like it was such good character writing and some relatively simple dialogue, but I think it worked. And then lastly is Renzo. This guy is my favorite character. I'll just go ahead and say he's my favorite character in the entire series. I wanted to like him from the very beginning. I think his character design, he just has this very sly look, which obviously very intentional, but there's a ton of stuff about him in the long run of things, the twist with his character, that's obviously very interesting, and the way that the author, it was a very unique way of dealing with this twist. I think it can be considered or interpreted as kind of a cop-out by so many other people, because having a character kind of betray the rest and still be relevant to the plot and still be close to those characters, and then making you question, did he actually betray the group? I think that is always going to be a difficult plot point to handle, but the way it was handled here, it was a fun way of handling it, and I think the author just did an amazing job with Renzo as a character throughout the entire manga pretty much, but especially once the reveal started happening, then that's when I really got into this character. Now there is the last guy that I have to talk about, Kon Komaru, and he's just very forgettable. I think that his character is necessary, and he's not necessarily underutilized, but he's definitely not utilized as much as he probably could be. But it's just, I feel like he does exactly what is necessary and not anything more. There's not really any dedicated arcs to his character, and any bit of an arc this character actually has is something that is done very slowly, very subtly over a longer period of time. His reaction to Rin, very understandable. His personality throughout the entire Kyoto arc, and then even going to now, where I've one cloth, some of the moments that he's had, where it's moments of, almost cowardice, and then kind of overcoming that cowardice, Maybe similar to a character like Usopp, I guess, but not really. But that analogy, I guess it kind of works in my eyes. I don't know if it kind of comes across that way. But overall, his character that is very forgettable, but I think that he's necessary and he does his job in the story. I didn't want to forget talking about him, but there's just not that much to say other than he's good, he's okay. But yeah, that's gonna be pretty much it. Blue Exorcist is way better than I originally thought, especially because I watched the first season and that only covers 2 arcs, and even the second season it only covers 1 more, so 3 arcs in total. And with the new anime currently airing, and it probably going to eventually get to the point where it covers, the Illuminati arc, which is my favorite, loosely, top 3 at least in the entire series. I think that maybe this series has the potential to finally just like skyrocket in popularity. I think that potential is there. Whether or not it does that, who knows.